Songs of the Season from Kelly Potter and K-Love. Beautiful. Well, it's nice to see that all of you made it out of your turkey coma or tofurkey coma, whatever the case may be. And that you made it past the mad rush of Black Friday. No one got injured trying to grab a TV, did they? Everybody's okay? Well, if you have your cell phones out, that's fine if you're tweeting things from the service, but if you're in line to get the first deal for Cyber Monday, I'd invite you to just put them away for a little while. Deal? Okay. Well, this is the first Sunday in Advent, and we are talking about the quality of faith. You know, Khalil Gibran says that faith is the knowledge within the heart beyond the reach of proof. You see, faith sometimes requires us to let go of what we think is real. It requires us to let go of the conclusions that we've gathered in our logical mind, because faith calls us to something bigger, something beyond common sense. Take my friend Susie, for example. I'm a big fan of Christmas movies, and my favorite old Christmas movie is Miracle on 34th Street. Anybody else? Yeah? The fact that they remade that movie I consider blasphemy, because there's nothing like that original. And it begins with this little girl named Susie, and she's been raised by a mom whose heart has been broken, and she's a little cynical about life. And so she's taught Susie to believe in only what she can see, only what is real. That's what you can count on. And so Susie hasn't learned to embrace her imagination. And I want to share with you this morning one of the opening clips from the movie Miracle on 34th Street with Susie and her friend. Susie doesn't believe in giants. She doesn't believe in fairy tales. She also doesn't believe in Santa Claus. But along comes a little old man who claims to be the Kris Kringle. Kris Kringle, who hails from the North Pole. You see, her mom worked for Macy's, and so she got to see every year who was hired to be the Santa. But there was something different about this guy. This guy had a real beard. He seemed to have a jolly persona, and he seemed to have a twinkle in his eye and a love for everybody around him that just made them feel better. It made her begin to wonder. Eric Butterworth said this about faith. All things are possible, not because God makes an exception for you by reason of your pleas, but because your faith is a key to the kingdom of power within you to apply the laws that transcend human limitation. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when you're going along and you're getting comfortable in your life and you think you have it all figured out, that life will throw you a curveball? That something will happen to shake you up, something that doesn't make sense, something that disturbs your neat and tidy way of life, something that for a minute makes you stop and wonder. You know, recently in the Journal of Antiquities, there was a report of an arrowhead that was found that's 64,000 years old. It was found in a cave in South Africa. And the thing about this arrowhead is that when they examined it, they noticed that it had remnants of blood and bone on it. And they also saw that at the edge of it was some resin, a glue-like resin that would have been used to attach it to the shaft of an arrow. Well, the thing that was so startling about this was that this predated by 20,000 years any evidence previously found of the use of a bow and arrow. You see, it was thought that people during that time didn't have the cognitive ability to create such an advanced weapon, and this finding caused them to rethink everything that they had thought about human evolution. It was just one of those things that made the scientists stop and go, maybe there's more than we know. So back to my friend Susie. She starts to become friends with Kris Kringle. They start to hang out together, and he begins to teach her about things like imagination, invites her to see beyond what she knows. And there is a moment in this movie in which she and Mr. Gailey go to the department store to meet her mother. And since they're early, they decide to wait in line to see Santa. Well, of course, she doesn't believe in Santa, but as she's waiting, a little Dutch girl comes up who's just arrived in the country and doesn't speak any English. The adoptive mom says, I'm sorry, she just came to us and she doesn't know any English. And Chris says, well, that's okay. And he pulls her up on his lap and he begins to talk to her in their native language. And not only that, but he seems to know all the Christmas songs that she grew up with. And they begin to sing together. Well, this didn't make sense to Susie. It made her start to wonder. William Wordsworth said that faith is a passionate intuition. Have you ever had one of those moments that defy common sense? That make you stop and realize there's more going on than what we see? I had one of those moments on Friday. A lot of times when I'm preparing for my talks, I take some reading material with me and I sit in Starbucks and do some research. And so I grabbed a couple books, taken them with me, and before I left, I grabbed a third book called The Book of Secrets by Deepak Chopra. I hadn't picked this book up in years, but something compelled me to take it off the shelf. And so I looked at it and I thought, I remember reading this and I don't think it had anything to do with faith. And I flipped through the table of contents and I thought, I'm not sure what in here applies to what I'm talking about on Sunday. But some voice said, take it with you. So I had just ordered my drink and I'm standing there and I turn around and I see this young man, Ben, who's a friend of my daughter's. They worked together when they were in high school and they worked at Starbucks. So you can see where I originally got my addiction to the place. I used to get free drinks and that was my downfall right there. Anyway, Ben was one of those kids that just had that something, that extra spark, that aliveness in him. And he was an artist, and so we would talk about art. And I noticed that he was a really deep thinker, and we got into some spiritual discussion. And so before he left for school, I decided to give him a book that I was reading through at the time. It was The Book of Secrets by Deepak Chopra. As we sat there, he said, I still have that book you gave me. And I reached down in my bag and I said, this one? And he said, yeah. Well, it wasn't like that had any significance in our conversation. We didn't go on to discuss the deep thoughts in that book. But for whatever reason, I grabbed that book on my way out. The book that I'd given this young man years ago, this young man who I had no idea I would run into. It was just one of those moments that made me stop and go, there's something more going on here. Something more than I can see, more than common sense would say is there. We sometimes miss out on the most amazing experiences in our life because we talk ourselves out of them, because they don't make sense, because when we're on the spiritual path and we're open to a bigger reality and we're in a quest to know God in a deeper way, the farther along we go, the less sense things make, but the more amazing and wondrous they are. So it's up to us in those moments to remain open to that. There's a story in the Gospels about Peter, and Peter is the disciple that represents faith. And the story goes that he's out in the ocean with a few of the other disciples on a boat, and there's a storm, and they're being tossed about. And Peter sees Jesus walking across the water, and he knows that if Jesus calls to him, that he can come to him, and so he does. And Peter steps out of the boat, and he begins to walk towards Jesus. And he's partway there, and suddenly he's distracted by the storm around him, and he becomes afraid, and he begins to sink. And in that moment, he calls out to Jesus, and Jesus grabs his hand, pulls him up. Well, it's kind of like that sometimes with faith. We feel pulled by something. We feel inspired by something. We have a great idea that lands in our awareness. And we start out in that direction, and we start to move that way, and suddenly we're distracted by the voices out here or in here that say, who are you to do this? Wait a minute. This is too easy. This isn't possible. Who are you to think that your one life can make that big a difference? We talk ourselves out of some of the most amazing experiences in our life when we lose faith. But you see, when Jesus grabbed his hand and pulled him up out of the water, that represents the Christ that's within each one of us that can pull us higher in those moments of fear and doubt, that can invite us into a state of faith, even when we can't see what's ahead, even when we don't understand why something has come into our life. Victor Hugo said, "Be like the bird that passing on her flight a while on boughs too slight, feels them give way beneath her, and yet sings, knowing that she hath wings." Who are you to come up with such a brilliant idea? Who are you not to? It can't be that easy, but what if it can? Who are you to make a big impact on this world? Well, who are you not to? And so what if it doesn't make sense? Things that are expanding our awareness and our understanding don't make sense. They invite us out of what we know and into something greater. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a couple of the magicians that are out there. I'm just amazed by the magic that is coming forth. There's a man named Chris Angel and David Blaine. Have any of you seen them? Well, I used to watch Chris Angel's show. And I remember the one trick that he did that still has me shaking my head. He was on a moving bus. He had boarded this random Greyhound bus that had stopped, and he began to travel with them wherever they were going. And he was doing different tricks with the passengers on the bus. And so he pulled this one lady up, and he spread out his deck of cards, and he said, "Pick a card out of here." And so she did. She grabbed out the ace of spades, and she showed everybody, and she put it back into the deck. And he said, "All right." And, still moving, he took the entire deck of cards and he threw it against the bus window. And stuck on the window was the ace of spades. But the amazing thing was that when the woman went up to make sure the card was stuck there, it was actually on the outside of the window of the moving bus. Now explain that to me. How is that possible? And so there was a special on in the last couple weeks with David Blaine, and he was interacting with a lot of famous people. And he was doing this one trick with Harrison Ford. And so same kind of thing. He showed him a deck of cards. He had him pick out a card, say what the card was, put it back into the deck. And then he said to him, "Go ahead and pick out an orange from the bowl of fruit there on the counter." And so Harrison Ford picked out an orange, set it on the counter. He said, "Now cut it open." He cut open the orange, and there, folded up and wet inside the orange, was the card that he had chosen. Well, I can't repeat what Harrison Ford said to him. But basically, he told him to get the heck out of his house. Isn't there a part of us that wants to believe in magic? That is knowing that there is something more than what we can experience with our five senses. The book of Hebrews says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not yet seen. So back to our friend Susie. As Kris Kringle is working with Susie on helping her use her imagination and see beyond what she has previously thought of as real, her friend Fred is working on her mom, showing her that it might just be possible to love again. And in the process, Fred, who's an attorney, has to prove that Kris Kringle is the actual Santa Claus. You see, he's been declared insane, and in order for him not to be put away, Fred has to convince this judge that this is the real deal. Well, I won't tell you how he does that. You can rent the movie for that. But if you don't want to know how this story ends, you might want to leave now, because I'm going to ruin it for you. There's a particular scene in which Santa, Kris Kringle, is sitting by Susie's bedside and they're talking, and he said, "You know, surely there's something you want for Christmas." And she's like, "No, whatever I want, my mom will get me." And he said, "Well, there's got to be something you've always wanted." And she goes, "Well, there is this one thing." And she reaches over into her bedside table and she pulls out this magazine page. And she unfolds it and shows him a picture of a house. And he said, "Oh, you want a dollhouse that looks like this?" And she said, "No, I want a real house. A real house where I can have my own room and where there's a swing in the backyard." And he said, "Well, you know, that's a pretty tall order." And she said, "That's what I thought." She goes, "If you can get it for me, then I'll believe you're Santa Claus. But if not, you're just a nice old man with a beard." Well, he said, "You know, I'll do my best, Susie, but I don't know, that's a lot to ask for." Well, this final scene that I'm going to show you is the scene in which Susie rushes to the Christmas tree and looks underneath and doesn't find what she wants. Go ahead, BJ. There's something within us that wants to believe. There's something within us that knows that that which seems impossible is only just out of our sight. There's something within us that knows that peace on earth is something we can achieve. There's something within us that knows that love can be the guiding force in all of our actions. Tagore says that faith is the bird that sings when the dawn is still dark. Perhaps this Christmas season, just for this few weeks, we can suspend common sense. We can let go of any limitation, any belief that says that things are not possible. And we can know that if we see them, if we believe them, then whatever was in our mind was first in the mind of God, and that the way is there for us to walk when we walk in faith. God bless you.